Good morning, Facebook. As you can tell, I am not your normal pastor. I am not your, as he say, the usher board number 3, he usually calls it, but that's not me. I am Kevin Thomas. I am a psychotherapist, and I also am an ordained minister. So this morning, though, I want to talk a little bit about what Pastor Copeland has been talking about for quite a while now. He's been talking about the pathway to intimacy. And so I, first of all, don't claim to know it all, but what I know, I will try to give it to you. I'm actually trying to pull up the Facebook Live now, so if you have any questions along the way, you can definitely chime in and I'll answer your questions as we are going. We have quite a bit of information that I want to get out to you guys, but I also want to be able to enjoy the moment. And in saying that, I want you guys to be able to interact. So as you guys start to chime in this morning, please put your questions into the chat box. Trying to make sure mine's coming up right now before we get started here. Yours coming up? You see it? Okay. All right. Well, they said it's up. I just can't see it on my end as of yet, but that is quite okay. So as we start to get into this morning, again, I am the psychotherapist here in Rockford, Illinois. I've been in therapy for quite a while, and one of the things that is taboo and is not talked about a lot is mental health in the churches particular. So if there anything that comes up, questions about mental health as concerned to the church, we're definitely going to talk about it, and we're going to make sure that as we talk about mental health, we talk about the church as well, and we're going to direct it from the church perspective anyway. But so let's talk about family trauma and how it influences our intimate connections. Now, there really isn't a such thing as family trauma per se. We call it generational trauma, intergenerational trauma, things of that nature. But for the sake of this conversation and for this teaching this morning, we're going to call it family trauma, because I think everyone needs to know and understand that trauma affects the family in a unique and different way. And so in order for us to be able to understand how the church must grow and how the church continues to grow, we have to understand the aspect of how trauma affects it. So without further ado, this morning, based on Scripture, 1 Corinthians 10 and 13 says that there hath no temptation taken you, but so as common to man, but God is faithful. God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that ye may be able to bear. And I want you to pay close attention to the way to escape. We deal with so many different things in life, and one of the things is being able to handle what life presents to us, what life gives us on a daily basis. And it is hard, it's tough, but at the same time, we can and will be able to endure it. We just need to make sure and understand that God has a way for us to move about our situations and get out of those things. So right now I'm trying to, my live video is interrupted, but that's okay, we'll keep going. So the Living Bible says it from this way, though, and I like this, and I went in and pulled his translations out so we can have a little bit more clear understanding of the direction we still want to go. It says, but remember this, the wrong desires that come into your life aren't anything new or different. Many others have faced exactly the same problems before you, and no temptation is irresistible you can trust God to keep the temptation from becoming so strong that you can't stand up against it. For he has promised this and will do what he says. He will show you how to escape temptation. I like that. He said, God will show you how to escape temptation. What are we talking about when we say escape temptation? One of the first things we're talking about is how we're escaping the emotional trauma and the generational trauma that has plagued us for many, many years, and that we've gone and not noticed it. Unconsciously, these traumas have been passed on through the generation, and we'll get more into it because at the same time, we're going to ask the question throughout this, what does this have to do with church? What does this have to do with following Christ? It has everything to do with following Christ and the church. So you just stay with me, and as we continue to go along, we'll make sure that we kind of let you know and give you the tools to move forward. So today, we're going to just lay out a bunch of information. And hopefully, prayerfully, next week we'll answer a lot of the questions that has been asked. It gives you time to kind of go through it and think about what you want to ask for next week. Romans 12:2 says that, and be not conformed to the world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. So what I'm here today to do is help renew your mind, help put you in the mindset of how to combat trauma, how to work through your trauma, and how to identify it, and especially when it comes to the church. So I want to make sure that we know that. Okay, so I'm looking for my chats now. It's not coming up here. Okay, well, you guys, I can't see your chats on my end, so if you've asked any questions so far and you're still trying to, I can't see it. When I get it up, I will, but in the meantime, I'll keep going. So we'll address family trauma from the collective through presenting generational trauma and emotional trauma. If we think about scripture, Exodus 34:6-7 talks about how Moses, when he was creating the tablets, the Ten Commandments, how the people were down below while he was up in the mountains. They were creating a false god. And one of the things about that is that fellowship, and then how this generation that Moses was creating what will become the next generation's problem. And so what I'm saying this morning is that if we're not careful and if we don't pay attention to what happens throughout our lifetime, unconsciously, we'll be passing on some traumas that we didn't even know we had. And not to mention passing it on to a generation that don't even know what they're inheriting. And so instead of passing along riches to our kids, we'll be passing on traumas with to our kids. And we definitely don't want to pass along traumas that we don't even know anything about. And so with that being said, it is so meticulous that you pay attention to your traumas, because even in utero, and I'm going to say that, you can pass along trauma. And people don't understand that women that deal with anxiety while they're pregnant and deal with traumas while they're pregnant, there is a possibility that they can be passed along to that child unknowingly. So can you imagine passing along trauma that you don't even know you have, one, or passing along anxiety you don't even know you have, but then your kid comes out with that. And so we want to be careful that we're acknowledging how powerful trauma can affect a family, more or less a person. So we want to make sure that we're understanding that. And I could get in depth with what Moses and people of Israel did. We already know the story. You know, they wandered around for 40 years. They murmured. They didn't listen. They did all these different things. And it always continued to go pass along to another generation. We like to, in the church, we like to talk about generational curses. Yeah. And here's the thing about generational curses. Generational curses is man-made. Generational curses are curses that are done by the individual, and they continue to pass it on, not knowing better or not having the tools to work through some of the things that they work through. Admittedly so, us in America, we still deal with the trauma of slavery. And that happened many, many years ago, but we're still dealing with it. And that's kind of how the cycle goes when it comes to generational trauma and emotional trauma. So what exactly is generational trauma? Well, the scientific definition of generational trauma states that generational trauma is a maladaptive behavior, which is a behavior that just uncommon behavior, and it's patterns that are being passed down from parent to children, and so on and so on. You get the drift. In everyday language, generational trauma is it's more like just being stuck in time. So in other words, when your heart have these wounds and you never heal from those wounds, and you continue to pass those wounds along to your kids, even communities. We're a church, right? And everyone that comes into the church are part of a community. And if we're not careful how we address people, how we come to contact with people, this is the intimate connection that we're going to talk about, is that can be pushed on or relayed to the person that's next to you, or that member that you so love so much at church, that mother on the mother's board, and that choir member, that youth member. All of those things can be passed on unknowingly. And so if we're not careful, we must understand ourselves, one, and then understand where we are in life, where we come from. So it's really good that you understand your history. Understanding your history. And the Bible always talks about history. That's one thing I love about the Bible, because it gives you history. It gives you a foundation to build on. And that's the same principle that we should do and use as a church, as a community as well. So while the next generation may not experience the same thing that we experience in the same event, this trauma can be chronic. You go to the doctor and they say, well, this is chronic pain, this is chronic this is chronic this. Meaning that because it's chronic, it continues, it never stops until it gets fixed. And most of the time, when it's chronic, it don't stop. And by it not stopping, it doesn't give you an opportunity to fix it along the way. So it may get to your 9-year-old, or it may get to your 5-year-old. And what do you do then? And those are the questions that we must ask ourselves when we're dealing with generational trauma, and how to slow it down, because this could be a cascade of just biological and behavior, emotional, relational consequences. And if we're not careful, we can transmit that from generation to generation, and we don't want to do that. We definitely don't want to do that. Now, so let me give you an example of how generational trauma works. So say there's a parent that experienced childhood abuse. Once they have their children, then they begin abusing their children. And the abuse from that parent continues to perpetuate and goes on to the child. And then that child grows up, he has or she has children, and then the child abuse continues. So you see how the cycle continues, it never stops. But here's the thing that happens, is most of the time the children don't understand where the abuse is coming from. So they're dealing with abuse from grandmama, because grandmama abused mama, and now mama abused me, so this is what I'm supposed to do. So it becomes common. It becomes common, but remember what the scripture says. There's nothing as such as common to man, that God can find a way for escape. And so we need to make sure that we're understanding that when we have these things that come into our lives, and to be honest with you, I'm not just talking about trauma all in itself. Any type of mental disorder, any type of mental illness that we deal with that goes unchecked. When it goes unchecked, then it's susceptible to kind of move on through the pathways and to the next generation. So we want to make sure that we're doing that. We're paying attention to ourselves. And one of the biggest things that we can do to help us with trauma is know your family history. Know your family history. We talk about family trauma. We talk about connecting in the intimate way. It is extremely important. And I have so much information that I can give you guys. And I'm taking my time to break this down because I think we need to understand the importance of passing something along that we don't know we have. And so if we're not connected to our parents or our grandparents, our forefathers, and we don't know our history, that trauma will continue to be passed along, such as in Moses' day, and the people just continue. Because some of us ain't gonna see the promised land, and that's what God was telling Moses, that some of these people, they're not gonna make it there because of what has happened in the past. And so we want to make sure that generation that does make it to the promised land understand their history of what trauma is and how it happens and how it affects us as a family. And so then that family piece, that intimate piece, that connection piece, we want to make sure that we're fostering healthy relationships. And I'll define intimacy in a second here, but I want to get to describing to you what emotional connection is. So I still can't see any questions on my live, but so guys, I guess I'll have to trust that you guys have put something in the chat. If anyone in here has a question I can answer, because I don't see it. But until then, if you don't have any questions, I'll keep going with that next subject, which is what is emotional trauma? So we talked about generational trauma. We talked about how it's being passed along. We talked about how we can move things along. So what is emotional trauma? Emotional trauma is pretty much the end result of whatever you've experienced. Like it leaves you feeling like unsafe. It leaves you feeling helpless. It can result from a single event. It can come from just being a part of an ongoing experience, which is that chronic trauma that we were talking about earlier, such as, like bullying in this day and time is just like a high. It's just rampant right now. Bullying is like a big thing. Discrimination, we've lived through that. And then also being humiliated throughout the process as well. So we want to make sure that we're understanding that emotional trauma, it actually is a companion to generational trauma. So if you're dealing with generational trauma, at some point it does become emotional. And I want you guys to remember a word, phrase, psychological pain. Psychological pain is what we deal with in our minds, and it gets to the point it's almost like a pressure. It's like a weight that's being pressed on us of we can't handle something, we can't deal with a thing, and we deal with it in unhealthy ways. And so when it comes to emotional trauma, we have to be extremely careful, because most of the time those individuals are very unpredictable because they're not acting rationally, they're acting on emotions. And if you ever want to understand and get the concept of the balance you should have, you should never have too much of emotional experiences versus rational decisions. There has to be a balance to where you can think through things. Prime example, if you ever had something that what they call an adrenaline rush. When you have these adrenaline rush, you just want to go, and you want to jump off the next mountain. That's emotional. And so when you're emotional, you get impulsive. And when you're impulsive, you make bad decisions and they become unhealthy. And now you're talking about how does that affect the church again? Because we want to make sure that we understand that everything that we're talking about here today, it affects the church. So how does it affect the church? At the end of the day, the church building is built up of church people. We are human before we become individuals or Christ-like individuals. When I say that is before you come to church, you are who you are. Before I come to church, I'm Kevin. Until I get to church, I become a part of a larger community, which is the community, the church, the people. Not the physical building, but the people. So we are the church. The people are the church. And so that's how it affects the church building. So the church is already being affected before we even get to the church building. And so that's why we must understand how serious this is, because we're actually bringing these traumas into the church building. The church body, the people, are actually bringing in the trauma that grandmama dealt with and great-grandma dealt with, and they don't understand what's happening to them, and they're giving that to the people that are in the church, which are the church people, the Christians. We are rubbing off, as they would say, rubbing off some of that trauma onto the next person. There's a movie that's called Fallen by Denzel Washington, and every time he would bump into someone, the spirit would jump off of him into someone else. And every time that person bumps into someone, that spirit would jump off to someone else. And he was chasing the spirit, the bad spirit that was plaguing the people. If we're not careful, come on, now I know y'all, we teaching Bible study this morning and Sunday school this morning, but when we come into the church and we have these spirits that we don't know we even have, and we're just bumping and rubbing off and hugging and laughing with one another, if we're not careful, we're going to send the wrong spirit to a person that can't even handle that spirit you had. So we got to make sure that we're coming and knowing as much as we can about ourselves, about our history, how it affects our family. So when we come into the church, that we can be our authentic selves. And in being your authentic self, that's saying, you know what? You get up in the morning, you put your clothes on. I don't feel good today. I feel, I feel like I'm not myself. Now, check and see what's going on with you. What happened? What happened between Sunday morning getting dressed and whenever the event happened during the week? Because if we're not careful, that unchecked trauma from Monday all the way to Sunday is going to pile up on us, and then we're going to display that in church service. And the worst thing to happen is your trauma to display itself in a place that you don't want it to. And most of the time, that's when it comes out, when you don't want it to. And so we have to make sure that we're careful, and that's that emotional trauma piece that I'm talking about, is that we have to make sure that we're in the mindset and the mind frame to understand the emotional piece of the trauma that we're dealing with, okay? So I said a lot of that to say that the Bible verses that we have in our Bible speaks directly to trauma, trials, and tribulations. We use that word all the time. Trials and tribulations and things of that nature. But it's a lot of biblical background when it comes to trauma. And just for a second, there's a couple that I found that I wanted to kind of address a little bit. So in Psalms 38:4, the Bible says that for my iniquities have gone over my head like a heavy burden. They are too heavy for me. David was struggling with troubles and thoughts and despair. And isn't that like us today? Is that we continue to deal with troubling thoughts and despair to the point where we find ourselves sitting idle or isolated trying to figure out what's going on with it. Sometimes we don't even sit and figure it out. We just kind of go. We have that impulsive spirit. That means that right away spirit. Like the first thought comes to your mind, you do it. And then you find yourself with police lights around you, or we find ourselves at the emergency room because we've made these thoughts, we made this despair moment with an impulsive decision, and now we find ourselves trying to figure out and backtrack and deal with that. So, but then there's Elijah. Elijah was discouraged, and he was just plain worn down. 1 Kings 19:4 says, "But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he prayed that he might die and said, it's enough. Now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my father. So when we as people of God see and hear about people committing suicide, completing suicide, or even having suicidal ideation, meaning thinking about suicide, it's a biblical thing. We're talking about biblical wars. We're talking about spiritual warfare here, that it does happen in the church. And we like to separate ourselves from the world, but we're not of the world, but we're in the world. And so we deal with the same thing that the world deal with. But we deal with it in a different way. We deal with it through Christ. But how many of us know that a lot of us can't see Christ because of our despair? A lot of us don't know how to go to Christ because our thoughts are cloudy. So if Elijah can go and sit up under a broom tree and contemplate suicide, what do you think we dealing with? Elijah had opportunities. God gave him opportunities. He gave him a foundation to build on, to be successful with. And we have the Word of God. We have our Bibles here that are our foundation, something that helps us through it. But at the same time, that doesn't stop life from happening. Life continues to go and happen even though you're dealing with what you're dealing with. So, which brings me to my last person that everyone always hear about. And see, we don't hear about David's and Elijah's despair as much. But there's one individual that I think that everyone in every country has known about, and that's Job. Everybody know what Job went through. Everything was taken away. Not because of something he did, but because Satan felt that he can shake him. Satan felt like he could take him out. But God said, no, I know my son. I know what Job is capable of. Can God say that about us? That's the question we should ask. Can God say that about us? Because guess what? Even if you don't think he said that about you, he's already said it. How many trials have you been through? How much have you done and God has kept you no matter what? We have been through so much as a country, as a city, as states, churches. We've been through a lot. There's been a huge drop off at the churches. All churches, not just one church, so ain't no church special. So at the end of the day, God puts these things out there, but we have to continue to push forward because he know us. He know what we're capable of. But the question is, do you know what you're capable of? So knowing your history, knowing how your family operates, knowing what your family has endured, you should be one to be eager to go and learn about your family. And my wife likes to talk about how she later in life understood how mental health actually hinders a person, or how it comes to the fold and how we don't know it. And I want to submit this morning is that spend some time with your elders. Spend some time with your older uncles and aunts and just kind of ask questions, trying to see what's going on or what happened in their time. Some of them will tell you some stories that just, those are family reunion stories. But then some of them will give you some serious information about your background that you should know. It's not good for the next generation or the generation after that to have to deal with something that we're dealing with now, or we never knew we dealt with. And they find themselves in a psychiatric hospital. They find themselves in an unknown place mentally. And so we don't want to set them up in that way. We want to pass along a rich and healthy inheritance to our kids rather than passing along this emotional trauma, which comes to intimacy piece. Everybody think intimacy in way of sexual. Well, intimacy happens on many, many levels. Spiritual intimacy, leisure intimacy, emotional intimacy, mental intimacy. I can go on and on about how and what intimacy is. But I want to talk more of this entire subject really talks about how that intimacy of generational trauma and emotional trauma, how that impairs. When I say impairs, that means it stops or it hinders our intimate connections with people. When I say intimate connection with people, is how we interact with each other. Yeah, I may not know you, but in the church, we like to hug people. You know, how you doing, sister? How you doing, brother? How you doing, deacon, pastor, so on and so on. But how many know that those connections are intimate connections? And as you build yourself into a church foundation and into a church community, your intimate connections grow. You start to talk to the person more on the phone. You start to be at church a little bit more. You start to attend these things. And even you start to have sidebar conversations after church. Instead of running straight home, you're sitting back and you're talking with members. Those are intimate connections. So by definition, though, intimacy in a relationship is a feeling of being close, an emotional connection and supported. It means being able to share a whole range of thoughts, feelings, and experience that we all have as human beings. And Scripture backs that up in Proverbs 17:17. It says, "A friend loves all the time, and a brother is born for a time of adversity," meaning that a brother is born, a sister is born for when you're going through. And it says that my command is this. This is what it says. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friend. Now, we can think of it in a literal sense of you actually laying down and dying for someone, but we can also look at it from the sense of the intimate connection with one another. Is that we have to learn that when we create these relationships in the church, outside of the church, that these connections can be intimate. But let's keep it, though, at the place where we're talking about how it influences our family. How our family connections, how our family trauma, how our generational and emotional trauma affects that. Well, let's talk about this. Do you ever feel like you're just in this cycle of destruction, like your behavior just every time you talk to somebody is negative? Every time you approach someone, it's okay. The day was okay. Or we love to say God is good, but is he really good? Because your behavior doesn't say that. And so we have to be careful that some of the things that we say. I'm really big on language and on terminology, because there is a such thing called context. And we do it all the time when we read our Bibles, is that sometimes we read our Bible out of context, meaning that if you're not reading it in context, you're really not getting the understanding of what it is. That's how life is. If we're not careful, we're reading people wrong. We're reading people out of context. And to be honest with you, we're reading people out of their trauma. We're reading people out of their emotional and generational trauma. But here's the thing, though. The Bible is straightforward. Whether you pick up the King James, the NIV, the NLT, whatever you pick up, the Bible is the same. The terminology changes, but the context never changes. When it comes to our trauma, the context changes because we look at it and interpret it from a different perspective. That's because everybody that receives what you're giving receives it differently. So if we're not careful, if my grandmama is used to always cussing people out, and then she passed it on to her daughter, and she cussing folks out, and they say, "Oh, that's just how Lou is. She just like that." And then Lou gets to the church house, and she let one go in the church house with one of the members, and we say, "Oh, that's just Lou being crazy." But we don't understand that comes from a long lineage of unhealthy behavior. And so trauma is unhealthy behavior. There is no way that I can spin this to say that trauma is a good thing, because it traumatizes the body. Trauma traumatizes the mind. And here's the biggest thing that I want everyone to understand is So I threw out the term psychological pain earlier, and which deals with more of your thinking, more of your cognitive ability. But what if I told you that trauma is a physiological thing, meaning a physical thing that starts in your body? A lot of people don't think about that. Because see, when people come to me and they sit on my couch and they say, you know, I'm dealing with X, Y, and Z, and I'm traumatized and this and that. And the first thing I ask them is, how do you feel? And most of the time people just say, my mind is spinning, it's doing this, and I just can't sleep, I can't do that. I said, how do you feel? Meaning, how do you physically feel in your body? Because this morning I want to show you and tell you that your anxieties and your traumas and your depression, all that stuff starts in your body. Think about this. When something happens tragic or traumatically, do you ever start to, first thing you do is you say, I'm thinking about this or I'm feeling like this. What about what you're feeling at the time? Someone has a car accident. They're traumatized by just getting hit. Their body's reacting to an event that traumatizes the body, that makes the body feel like it's in shock. And so when you're dealing with trauma, the first thing you should ask yourself is, how do you feel? Our body is like a sponge. Our body's like a sponge. What happens is we have what we call the brain stem that connects your body to your brain, right? What happens is when your body is impacted, it sends a signal to your brain that says, guess what? Something just happened at normal. Something happened that you didn't think that was going to happen. So you need to check yourself. But this is what happens, and this is how generational trauma starts too, is that trauma starts in the body. It's what we call somatic experiencing, meaning that the body is experiencing a shock. And when the body experiences a shock, it absorbs it. If anybody know what memory foam is when you squeeze it, eventually it comes back to its shape, right? It comes back to its form. Well, this is what happened when a trauma happens. When a trauma happens, we pick ourselves up and we go and we just keep it moving. But then guess what? When something else happens, like you're sitting and riding in the car with your friends and you're pressing your feet to the floor, that's because the trauma response is like the memory foam. Guess what? It's coming back again. That trauma response is saying, do you remember last month or 2 months ago when you had that car accident? Now your body is going back to that traumatic experience and it's displaying itself again. And until you start to really work through those things somatically, through the body, through the physical way, you are still going to experience those things. That's why we have yoga today. We have mindfulness. We have deep breathing. These are things that helps the physical. And so why am I telling you about all of that as it relates to the church? If we're not careful, that memory foam of trauma that you have is going to happen in the midst of church service. And you're not going to know how to deal with it because you never dealt with it. Let me say that again. You're not going to know how to deal with it because you never have dealt with it. So you have to deal with your own traumas. And the only way you deal with it is you're going to have to do a little history on your family lineage. And then you're going to have to ask yourself, how is it affecting me? If we're not careful, and we love to say Satan did this and Satan did that, well, you know, Satan has a hand at some things, but not all things. And then not only that, God is the author and finisher of all of our faith, right? So that means that God has the power we can overcome these things if we put ourselves in a position to deal with the emotional and the generational trauma. And so that interrupts our family, our connection, our intimate connection to people. So if you're tracking with me this morning, you got to understand that what happened in the past, if we're not careful, will affect your relationship with people. How you address people, how you see people, how you view people. And nine times out of 10 in the church, we become judgmental because we don't understand the traumas, the intimate connections that we're building and we're fostering in the church. And that's why it's very important that we understand the history of it all. At the end of the day, it is up to us to ask ourselves, how does that affect us? And so many times in the church, we say, what does the church have to do with mental health? What does the church have to do with trauma? Is it biblical? Is there any hope? I just laid it out for you. There is hope. Anytime you're a child of God, there is hope. God has shown us that through Elijah, through David, through Job. And if you don't know anything about trauma and destitute, being isolated and feeling alone, go back and read Job. Because at the end of the day, Job shows us how to go through our traumas, but he also shows us who to lean on when we're going through our traumas. Because if we're not careful, just like Job, he had some friends that questioned why he was still serving or wanted to serve God, and he wouldn't curse God. And the first thing we do in our traumas, when we're dealing with stuff we don't even know what we're dealing with, the first thing we do is like, why God do this to me? Here's the thing that I started asking myself as a Christian, as a child, God-fearing child of God, is why not me? Because if I'm supposed to be the light in a dark world, then how am I going to be a light in a dark world if I don't ever experience anything to show them what the light looks like? So when we're going through as Christians, we need to ask ourselves, okay, God, I'm going through this, but why am I going through this, and who am I going through it for? Because I realize that the things that we deal with today and how we deal with it always influences and encourages the person that see it. So if you're going through these experiences and you're asking yourself, why me, instead of saying, okay, God, who is this for? Not you. We're a byproduct of healing. We're a byproduct of saving people. We're a byproduct of bringing people into Christ. Because how we deal with things is how people see us, how people perceive what God is like. Especially when we say we're a child of God, it's like, this is what a child of God does. He or she moves in a way, transparent, humility, and not only that, we say, okay, God has taken us through this so I can help someone else. Because our experiences are not for us. Our experiences is to give to someone else. We are a byproduct. We are a conduit. We are a person, individual that carries on these problems and these issues to show other people how you actually handle it. But that's only when you have a relationship with Christ. Only way you have a relationship with Christ is you have to understand where your traumas lie. Only way you understand where your traumas lie is you have to know your history, your family history, and then understand how that helps you build your intimate connections. At all costs, we are made to be interdependent people, meaning that we're made to fellowship with one another. We're made to socialize with one another. And so in that is, how do you socialize? How do you have these intimate connections with people if you don't know these things about yourself or where you come from? And so that's one of the things that we must focus on when we talk about generational and emotional trauma, how it truly affects us and how it affects us from a biblical standpoint. Because there's no way we can have these conversations about, about being a part of a community such as the church and not understand that we do deal with things when it comes to church. It's so common for us in the church to deal with trauma. And it's so common that we don't know it's common. Let me say that again. It's so common that we deal with trauma in the church and that we don't know it. And it's so common that trauma is in the church. See, in particular, families. A lot of families we are protected people. Our community, our culture as black people, we are a people of embarrassment. We don't like people to look at us a certain way. We have these common values of I got to be strong, I got to be strong-willed, I got to be independent, I got to do this. But do you know 50% of all men deal with trauma? 60% of women deal with trauma. So at some point, we're going to at least have to deal with some traumatic event or continue to deal with one or two or many other traumatic events. So, and that's just research that says that. So can you imagine what we're going through in the church? So I said that to say this, and this is a church stat right here. I'm going to give us how common church trauma is in the church. How common trauma is in the church. Each and every minute, 20 people are physically abused by their intimate partner in the church. Yeah. I said each and every minute, 20 people are physically abused by their physical partner in the church. Abuse and neglect are reality for 1 in 7 kids in the church. PTSD is developed 4% of men and 10% of women in the church. Roughly 8 million people will develop PTSD in any given year in the church. 8 million people in churches across this country will develop PTSD. That's post-traumatic stress disorder. 8 million people. And sexual violence, 20% of men in the church. 20% of men endure sexual violence during their lifetime. These are church members we're talking about here. And guess what the number is for women? Now, if you got 20% for men, 50%. So that's half of a church. If you're in church and half of the women in that church have been sexually assaulted. So you want to ask the question, how common and how serious trauma is? It is very serious. I mean, extremely serious. You cannot speak about trauma. You cannot speak about church and not speak about trauma. And we don't do it. Why is that? Why do we in our churches do not speak on subjects such as mental health problems or illness or trauma when we're all of the body of church and we all hurt? We all go through what we go through. I just read to you the stats that happens in the church across America. Think about your church. I don't want you going and looking at folks and, asking, but think about how staggering that is. 20%, 50% of your women in the churches. That is extremely high. Extremely high. And so it's very important that we understand how serious this is, how these generational and emotional traumas affect how we connect with people. If anybody know, and this goes back to what I was saying about the physiological thing and the somatic experience of a person, when they endure some type of sexual violence, if you ever notice, people, when you touch people, people shiver, people cringe, people are standoffish. It's because, not because they've been assaulted, but because of the feelings they have of being close in proximity to another person. It feels awkward. I'm going to be honest with you. It feels awkward. But at the same time, is the only way you build those emotional connections, you have to be resilient. You have to put God first, and you have to say, Lord, look, how do we handle this? What do we do? What do I need to do? Talk to the Lord first. Get in your word. Get you a therapist. That's what you do. That's exactly what you do. And I am a psychotherapist. I'm licensed in this area. And I'm going to tell you, the first thing you need to do is go to God first. Because that's what's going to lead you to where you need to be spiritually and emotionally. Because at the end of the day, you can go out and grab your therapist, and you can go grab one, but you need one that's going to speak to your spirit, that's going to speak to your mind, and that's going to speak to your body. Because at the end of the day, we're talking about some long lineage of stuff that's been dealt with or not dealt with. And it's just like the doctors. You don't want to go put your life in a doctor's hand that you've heard so much about that ain't did nothing but cause nothing but ruckus in the town. Every time you turn around, he's not a good doctor. Same thing with therapists. You need to do your homework. You need to talk to people. You need to learn about that person. Do whatever you have to do. But make sure you see someone that aligns with your values. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. You come to my office, I'm not going to bring up God until you bring it up. But here's how it works, though. God never does not ever give me an opportunity where I don't speak about him. That's how it works. So that's how my God works. And that's what God does when it comes to me treating people, me working with people, is because God sends people that I can relate to and they can relate to me. Now, there are some, I'm not perfect, there are some that just don't work, right? But at the same time, they have to respect who I am as a person, as a man. I'm a God-fearing man. And so any opportunity that God gives me to speak about him, I'm going to speak it to him. Because, look, my education is limited when it comes to God, as it compares to God. God is what got me to where I'm at, keeps me for where I am, and takes me where I'm going. Everything else is secondary. So at the end of the day, we are talking, and we have talked about the generational trauma and the emotional trauma and how it's biblically tied and how it affects our family, how it affects our connection with people. And so as I'm getting ready to wrap up here in a few minutes, is that it's so much more that I have, but this is one of those subjects that is always ongoing because trauma never stops. It's chronic. It's complex. It's everything that you think it is. It's because that's what it does to the person, to the individual. It confuses them. It makes them feel out of place, like a fish out of water. It makes them feel uncomfortable. And so can you imagine, and I want you to think just for a minute, the most uncomfortable feeling you've ever had. Think about that. The most uncomfortable feeling that you've ever had. That's from childhood to where you are right now. Think about that being on display in front of a crowd of people. That right there has enough to have you crawl back into your shell right there. Just to know your most uncomfortable time that you've ever had play out in church. While the pastor's preaching. While the teacher's teaching. While you're engaging and fellowshipping with your fellow church member. So if we're not careful, if we don't check our history, if we don't start to delve into knowing our family, then guess what? We're going to find ourselves on the other end of this thing. And it's always, I'll tell people this, is rather than be reactive, be proactive. Start working on that stuff early. Start trying to figure things out early. Because I guarantee you, every one of us on this Facebook this morning, we can go back and trace one thing that happened. And we're like, where did that come from? Why did I do that? And track that back to some stuff that has happened throughout your family. and it can unravel a whole bunch of stuff. So we have to understand, though, all of this is not possible without leaning on God, though. And the one thing that I will say, we cannot reach people by just beating them with the Bible. We cannot reach people until we start to meet them where they are. If somebody's in life experience, you meet them there. You don't go and give them this wealth of experience they can't handle. You have to meet people where they are. So I said that to say, and I want to kind of start to end on this. I said that to say is that I remember growing up, and my grandparents, or my grandmother rather, taking medication. Because I want to speak to, just for briefly, to a lot of the older members. My grandmother had this medication, and she would always say something to the effect of, it's just my nerves. This is my nerve medicine. And at the time, as a kid, I didn't think of it, and it didn't make sense to me. And as I got older, and as I started to get into the realm of therapy and counseling, is that I now vividly remember the medicine she was taking. And it was a psychiatric medication. Stuff that I treat people for every day. She was taking it, but she was saying it was her nerve medicine. And we didn't think nothing of it as kids. She was dealing with depression and anxiety back then, and she didn't even know what it was, or she was embarrassed to tell people what it was, or whatever the reason. But me, if I wasn't in the field that I'm in now, I would have never known what it was she was taking. But now looking back at it makes me want to do my history. Makes me want to go back and ask the question, is like, what was she dealing with that I dealt with? I had a father that wasn't present. But I had siblings that he raised. So think about that. When you're young, you got siblings that he's raising, but you're not being raised by him. So you getting all this going on. You got the parents fighting, going through this, and you're a part of it, and you don't know what's this going on, and you got siblings over here, and you've been left alone. What do you think that does to a person when they become adults? I became an angry child because I couldn't understand the dynamics of adulthood, the experiences that they were dealing with. So again, if we're not careful, those family traumas, those intergenerational traumas, those emotional traumas will play out in our adult lives. What we are doing now, how we're going about things now, how we're greeting and interacting with people now is a direct result of how we were raised. All of us was raised differently, but at some point, we were raised in a way that was not healthy. And if we even had two parents in the home, that was somewhat healthy, but was it? That's a question to ask. If you have had both parents and they were good to you, great. But there's still some things that you may have missed and not even know about. So I ask you guys to really think about this subject this morning of family trauma and how it influences our intimate connections. Because next week we're going to come back and we're going to just finish up. I got through half of this because really just laying the foundation of how trauma affects us, how trauma is working in the church as we speak, and how trauma, if we don't get a hold or get control over our history and our emotions and our intergenerational trauma, then guess what? We will be like the children of Israel. We won't get to see the promised land. Whatever that is for us and for you, is we won't get to that point where God promised us there will be land of milk and honey. So we want to make sure that we are doing our due diligence and making sure we're making preparation for ourselves to learn about our history. And even if you want to pass something along, why don't you pass something to your children that said, hey, let's check out our history. Let's see what makes us tick. Let's see what happened throughout the years that caused us to act and behave and connect with people in this manner. So thank y'all this morning. I really appreciate it. This was awesome. Thank Pastor Copeland in his absence for allowing me to do what I do, and I appreciate it, and hopefully I'll see you guys next week. Godspeed.